White nationalist Richard Spencer spurred controversy leading up to his speech at the University of Florida on Thursday. Protesters and supporters of Spencer gathered on campus, where hundreds of law enforcement officers were tasked with keeping the peace. Well, police made at least 2 arrests Thursday night. CBS News' Hena Doba has more.
Protesters took over the speech by white nationalist Richard Spencer, many cursing at him, holding their fist in the air and chanting. Most of Spencer's supporters occupied the front rows and cheered him as he tried to take control of the half-filled auditorium at the University of Florida. At one point, police held a man back from the stage, while others in riot gear readied themselves in the balconies.
You think that you shut me down? Well, you didn't. You actually even failed at your own game.
Spencer took some questions from the audience, but continued to be heckled. Outside the venue, hundreds of protesters gathered.
We don't want him here. We don't want to hear him speak.
Since he's here, we're going to be here too.
Spencer rented the space for a little less than $11,000. The security is costing Florida taxpayers $600,000.
Ahead of the event, the state of Florida declared a state of emergency to make sure they had enough law enforcement officials on hand to keep the peace and prevent the deadly protests that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia in August. Hena Doba, CBS News, Gainesville, Florida.
CBS News correspondent Mark Strassmann is in Gainesville, Florida. Mark, you attended Richard Spencer's speech. What did you hear from him, and what was the atmosphere there like?
Well, it's interesting, Rena. I mean, this university never invited Richard Spencer here. He invited himself. He essentially forced his way on campus because hate speech is generally considered to be protected speech, and so the university, as a public university, state university, felt as though it had no choice but to admit him. But once he got inside into the auditorium, about half full, 300 people, I'd say less than 20% of them were supporters of his, and by and large for 2 hours he was jeered and shouted at and shouted down. He and 3 other speakers took turns with a microphone trying to talk to the crowd, trying to engage the crowd, and by and large that just didn't happen. And at one point Spencer actually shouted out to the crowd that they were being screaming, shrieking morons. Once you start calling your audience names, you've lost control. And so they never really regained control on stage. And by and large, the message from this university community was, you're not welcome here, and take your brand of political philosophy somewhere else.
I see the law enforcement behind you, the police there. Mark, what were the protests like, and how did law enforcement respond?
Yeah, this is the Florida Highway Patrol's quick response force, and there was an overwhelming police presence here. These guys were never needed. There were several hundred protesters outside. There was at least one confrontation. A Richard Spencer supporter who was wearing a T-shirt with swastikas on them was punched, bloody lip, led away by some cops. But by and large, there was also some shouting that went on, but nothing more serious than that. But the overwhelming majority of people on the outside and on the inside were protesting the appearance by Richard Spencer and his group. There were about 3 dozen of his supporters inside, dressed all the same in the white shirts and the khakis, but outside, very, very few people who were obvious Spencer supporters.
Mark Strassmann on the ground there in Gainesville. Mark, thank you so much.